Again, welcome to the PSA Train the Trainer Refresher Office Hours series. Today we'll be discussing Module 4. My name is Connie Fisk. I'm the PSA Northwest Regional Extension Associate. And as I was just mentioning to everybody before I hit record, I was actually a wildlife major before I was lured away by food science. So I love teaching Module 4. It's a lot of fun. It's also the module that's right before lunch when we're teaching a face-to-face course oftentimes. And so it's nice that it's one of the ones that kind of goes a little fast because you know people are looking forward to lunch. Just a little housekeeping. First of all, everyone is muted. There will be time for questions and discussion at the end of the meeting. If we don't have time to get to all the comments or questions, we will compile that information via text, and that will be shared after the session. Also, this session is being recorded and it will be shared on our website later this afternoon. As a reminder, the purpose of this series is to review the critical concepts from each module and to share recent FDA updates, PSA resources, other tips for presenting remotely. And the intended audience is PSA trainers and lead trainers, though anybody is welcome to listen in. It might be kind of confusing for folks that aren't familiar with the PSA grower training curriculum. And just a couple disclaimers. We are going to run through this really fast. I'm just going to hit some high points of things that I focus on when teaching Module 4, some ways that I try to engage with my audience, because again, this is a really important topic, but it's going to differ by farm. So again, I'm going to run through it really fast and just kind of hit some of those high points. So watching these recordings does not count as attendance at a Train the Trainer course or a grower training course, because we're not going to cover everything. Nor will anybody who's watching these recordings earn a certificate of completion. So again, this is just meant to be a refresher for our trainers. Also, the PSA grower training slides are copyrighted. They may not be published electronically without express permission of Cornell University, nor sold in whole or in part by a third party or a company for profit. And with that, I'm going to jump into Module 4, Wildlife, Domesticated Animals, and Land Use. This module discusses hazards associated with animals in the growing area. As you know, every module begins with learning objectives, and there's no need to read them word for word, but use them to highlight the topics that are going to be covered in the allotted time. Again, with an emphasis on those steps towards produce safety that we talked about in Module 1, and that's the pattern we follow in every module. So first, we're going to assess produce safety risks, then implement practices to reduce risks, and monitor to make sure those practices are done properly. Then corrective actions. So these are actions taken to correct a problem and also to identify why it happened so we can prevent it from happening again. And then finally, record keeping. So again, you don't have to read these learning objectives word for word, but try to pull out those critical details that you want to highlight so that growers know going in what we're going to cover in this module. Module 4 is generally divided into these three sections: wildlife and co-management, that's slides 6 through 13, livestock, working animals, and pets, so that's the domesticated animals part of this module, and that's slides 15 through 19, and then the regulatory requirements specifically on slides 20 through 24. As we learned in Module 3, where we discussed biological soil amendments of animal origin, animal feces can contain human pathogens. And slide 4 describes why animals themselves are a produce safety concern, because they can carry human pathogens, they can spread human pathogens, and they are very difficult to control. It also introduces the requirements of Subpart I. So these are sections 112.81, 0.83, and 0.84 in the produce safety rule. So that's another reason I kind of like teaching Module 4 is it only has a few requirements. So it's pretty easy to hit them pretty hard and make sure growers really take away those main points. These requirements are introduced in the notes for this slide, and then we're going to cover them in more detail as we move throughout. So again, slide 4 is kind of an introduction. Here's what we're going to cover in this module. I do like to draw attention to the last two bullets in the notes for slide 4. They say the requirements outlined in 112.81, 0.83, and 0.84 apply when a covered activity takes place in an outdoor area or a partially enclosed building, and when under the circumstances there is a reasonable probability that animals will contaminate covered produce. So that's one of them. And then the second bullet at the bottom says, the requirements do not apply when the covered activity takes place in a fully enclosed building. And these requirements also do not apply to fish used in aquaculture operations. Again, depending on who's in the audience, if they grow only indoors or have aquaculture operations, you may want to spend more time at the beginning of Module 4 making sure they understand this important detail. And then also, we like to remind folks of what we talked about earlier in the training, but also kind of preview some things we'll talk about in the future that is also related to this topic. So again, that last bullet point in the notes says some other requirements in subpart L related to domesticated animals and pests are going to be covered in Module 6. So again, we'll come back to talking more about animals when we get to Module 6. But in this module, we're specifically talking about animals in the growing area. All right, slide 5. This slide is optional, but I like to use it to get growers to think about the contamination risks associated with animals on their farm. In fact, we've even turned this slide into a clicker question. So if you download the clicker questions, you'll see another way to use it. You could start by asking growers about the risks they see in this illustration. Now, in a face-to-face course, you could have them raise their hands or just shout out answers. But in a remote course, you need to think about it ahead of time. How are you going to engage your audience with this slide? How would you like them to participate? Do you want them to unmute themselves? Do you want them to raise their hand in the participant window and wait to be called on? Do you want to use annotate to have them draw on the image or maybe place a stamp? Or maybe you want them to type in the chat. So again, get them to think about what are the risks that they see in this image and how are you going to get them to engage with this image. Then after those risks have been identified and discussed, you could ask them which one of these risks is the greatest on their farm. So now they've identified risks in this hypothetical picture, but then get them to take it one step further and think about what does this mean for me in my unique situation? And why? What is the biggest risk for me and why? This information can help you as the trainer understand where you need to spend additional time in the module. Are they really concerned about a lot of CAFOs in the area? Are they worried because they're in a migratory bird path? You know, all those things that could help you know where to spend more information or spend more time later in the module. Okay, slide 6. This is the first in a series talking about wildlife and co-management. So use it as an introduction. Not all wildlife are bad, but if food safety risks are identified, we need to implement practices to reduce those risks. So that's that umbrella statement. So we're not saying that wildlife are bad, but if there's risk involved, then we need to take steps to reduce that risk. Controlling wildlife is a complex process. It may require multiple strategies. And one important point to make here is that management options may be limited by county, state, or federal law. So for example, some animals may not be moved to another property, or you may only be allowed to move them a certain number of feet. Other animals are protected from harassment. So it's important that growers know what's required locally when dealing with wildlife. A nuisance permit may be required for some animals, for example. And if this isn't your area of expertise, you may want to share fact sheets or links to more information from those agencies so growers know where to get more information or who to call to ask a question about a pest. All right, slide 7. Slide 7 contains questions to focus the growers on the challenges unique to their farm and what they're already doing to control them. This slide contains leading questions to really help you generate a discussion around those wildlife challenges. Do you find wildlife feces in your production fields? Is your farm in an area that large numbers of animals visit? What management practices can limit wildlife contamination of produce fields and water sources? Remember that you're allowed to swap out photos too. On any of the PSA grower training slides, you can't change the text, but you can swap out photos. So for example, I cover the Northwestern United States, and alligators aren't a really big concern for us. So I replaced this picture with a picture of a beaver, which is also a little shout out to my alma mater. So that's something that you're allowed to do, is swap out the pictures. This slide, slide 7, is also another good place to draw attention to local resources. For example, some of the teams that I work with share local fact sheets about how to identify pests by their tracks, by their feces, because you really need to know what pest you're dealing with to know how to monitor it, how to control it. So those are some other things that you may want to insert here. All right, co-management. Co-management may be a new term for many growers. So time should be spent going over this definition. As stated in the glossary and the notes for slide 8, co-management is defined as the practices which minimize the risk of fecal contamination and microbiological hazards associated with food production while simultaneously conserving soil, water, air, wildlife, and other natural resources. So a key message in this sequence of slides is that implementing food safety practices does not require growers to destroy their conservation areas or break with their conservation goals. So again, this is a slide and a topic that you might want to spend a little bit more time on depending on your unique audience, because growers often have sustainability goals, they have conservation areas, and so it's important to make the point that they are not required to destroy those in the name of food safety. Understanding food safety risks introduced by wildlife is a very complex task, even for researchers who have been exploring this for a long time. So this slide, slide 9, and its notes highlight the fact that removing wildlife habitat may or may not mitigate these hazards. So again, just driving home that point that growers are not required to get rid of habitat. In some cases, it may actually increase food safety risks. So again, from the notes, careful monitoring for unintended consequences of management practices on both food safety and conservation is important for sound co-management. And scientific evidence, not assumption, should guide risk management. So again, growers are the best people to figure out what is best for their farm. They can take all this information that we're sharing with them, they can read research reports, make a decision on their farm, but then they need to also watch and see what happens, because that's really going to tell them what impact those practices are having on their farm. And again, we're talking about food safety here, but we're also talking about co-management, so managing the entire system. So again, I like to spend time on definitions, depending on the audience I have, just to make sure they really understand what we're talking about here, and make sure they understand what the rule does and does not require. Slide 10 takes that one step further and gives some examples to consider. Again, this could be a good place to pause and have a discussion with the growers in your group to see what they're already doing to support co-management on their farms. Because chances are they're doing these practices, they just aren't using this term to describe them. So again, it's putting us all on the same page. All right, so here's another clicker question, or an annotate question if you're presenting in Zoom, just to make sure everyone in your audience understands this important point, what we were just talking about on the previous few slides. So true or false, co-management means that conservation of natural resources takes priority over produce safety. Okay, so annotate is at the top of your screen under view options. So go up to annotate and pick a stamp and put it in the box that you think is correct. Is it true or false? Co-management means that conservation of natural resources takes priority over produce safety. Looks like most people are voting false. I see they have to work together. Very good. Okay, so again, as the instructor, this shows me that yes, I did a good job of driving home that point, or maybe folks already knew it before I presented it, but we're all on the same page now as we shift into the next topic. If there were a couple people that had marked true, that would be a sign that I need to go over that point again, or to have a bit of discussion about why did you answer true. Okay, maybe they have a really good point, and it's again an opportunity to have a discussion. There, Dawn chose true, right? So it's an opportunity to have a discussion about this important topic before we move on. You may find that discussing wildlife with growers is one of the most frustrating topics, because most growers are already doing everything they can to control wildlife, because wildlife tear things up and wildlife reduce crop yields. So slide 11 allows us to go into some detail here. Just be aware that it might be a tense topic for some growers. It is good to point out that the title of this slide is monitoring wildlife activity, not controlling wildlife activity. The produce safety rule requirements are about reducing risk, not eliminating risk. You know, there's no way you could control all wildlife. And so growers need to know that that's not what the rule requires. It requires monitoring the wildlife activity. The produce safety rule requirements help us avoid consumption of fresh produce items that are contaminated or reasonably likely to be contaminated, for example, by animal feces, because we know that that carries human pathogens. The produce safety rule requirements do not require farms to control animal access to growing areas, but they do require that farms appropriately deal with produce that may be contaminated by animals that are in that growing area. So it's an important distinction. And note that the monitoring requirements are different during the growing season compared with close to harvest. So we're going to talk about both those things. Those are two separate requirements in the produce safety rule. And also on this slide, I like to make the point that there's nothing in the produce safety rule that gives you permission to kill endangered species. Okay, you can't take threatened or endangered species as identified in the Endangered Species Act. So all the produce safety rule requires is that we monitor this wildlife activity and we take steps to reduce the risk to produce safety. All right, slides 12 and 13 offer examples, ways that you can deter wildlife. And there are a lot of details in the notes, as well as additional resources that you as a trainer can check out if this topic is new to you. So again, we often assign maybe the new trainer on the training team to teach Module 4 because it is pretty easy. There are only a few requirements. But if that person doesn't have a background in wildlife, it's good to do a little homework ahead of time in case growers have questions, to be able to give more realistic examples. So these two slides give lots of examples, but they also give a lot of background information that you may want to check out before you teach it for the first time. So here's just the second, deterring wildlife. Again, you can swap out these photos if these aren't representative of what growers in your area do, but you have to leave the text. All right, slide 14. This one's optional, but it can also be used as a transition slide. We were just discussing wildlife and now we're getting ready to talk about domesticated animals. So this is where they overlap. Livestock, working animals, and pets is another sensitive topic to discuss with growers because they're often attached to the animals on their farms. They may consider them an integral component of sustainability on their farm. And this slide introduces the topic of domesticated animals. It's also a good place to ask growers then how they're using animals on their farm. It's kind of hard to see in this photo, but those are chickens in a strawberry patch. So as a PSA trainer, you're probably seeing risks everywhere. So that would be something to discuss. If somebody wants to know what's going on in this photo, those are chickens, right? They can be really useful for controlling insects, but is it worth the risk of having chicken poop in your strawberries? I don't think so. But again, it's a place where you could have a discussion because growers are going to be using animals on their farms and for different roles. So again, engaging in some discussion here can really help you as a trainer know how to spend your time on the next few slides. What topics are going to be most useful to your unique audience? Some common topics here include when a field can be planted with cover crops after it's been grazed, or whether using a dog to keep wildlife away from growing areas is allowed, Or what is the trade-off for farms that choose to use working animals like horse-drawn wagons in production fields? So again, this is a good place to kind of pause and get that feedback from your audience to see the ways they're using animals, domesticated animals on the farm, or even if they allow certain wildlife on their farm for these roles. So for example, folks build raptor habitat around their fields to help control rodents, or maybe they have a coyote that lives in the area and they don't harass that coyote because they know it helps control the rabbits. You know, there are lots of topics that could come up on this slide. The more you teach this module and the more you get to know the needs of the growers in your state, the better prepared you're going to be to address their questions on this topic. All right, slide 16. This one provides another opportunity to generate discussion and really gear the training around the needs of your unique group of growers. It contains some leading questions to generate discussion around assessing risks from domesticated animals specifically. Are domesticated animals allowed in the field while the crop is present? Are your workers aware of cross-contamination risks? You know, fecal contamination from their hands, clothing, shoes, and equipment. Are production fields rotated into grazing land? So those are all really good questions to take a minute and ask the growers in your group. The produce safety rule requirements in Module 4 are generally about monitoring for contamination at 2 points in the growing cycle, during the growing season and immediately prior to harvest. Slide 17 is about assessing that risk before planting. I draw attention to the section symbol here because the notes contain those specific produce safety rule requirements. And then slide 20 is going to cover that pre-harvest assessment. They're separated in the PowerPoint and in the manual, but if you want to, you could even move slide 20 up and talk about them both together. Okay, because those are the 2 requirements, assessing risk before planting and before harvest. Slide 18 talks about working animals. In your prior discussion, you may have learned that none of the growers in your audience uses working animals, or they're not going to admit to it in public. If no one's using working animals, you don't need to spend as much time on this slide, but there are some important points here. One important point is that the produce safety rule doesn't forbid the use of working animals in growing areas. However, if growers are using working animals, they must control the risks associated with that practice. Those farms would have to studiously monitor and discard contaminated produce, for example. Or they might choose to use some of their growing lanes as drive lanes, where working animals can walk without contacting the covered produce. So those are just a couple points I like to make on this slide, even if no one in the room sounds like they're using working animals in this way, just to let them know that it's not prohibited by the rule. The next slide is all about pets. And we all love our pets, and pets are something we often see on farms. But if they're not on the farm to do a job, they should stay at home. Working dogs and cats are not prohibited by the produce safety rule. However, again, if you're using them as working animals, their presence should be monitored, and you should have a corrective action plan in place for their presence. Also, another important point on this slide goes back to visitors, which we discussed in Module 2. Visitors to the farm should be instructed to leave their pets at home. So that's an important point that might generate some discussion in your group as well. Okay, here's slide 20 on pre-harvest assessment. This includes the requirement from 112.112 as listed in the notes, which requires immediately prior to and during harvest, those subject to the rule must take all measures reasonably necessary to identify and not harvest covered produce that is reasonably likely to be contaminated with a known or reasonably foreseeable hazard, including steps to identify and not harvest covered produce that is visibly contaminated with animal excreta. So on this slide, really emphasize that fresh produce that has been contaminated cannot be harvested, okay? So the requirement itself is really long. It's a run-on sentence, kind of hard to wrap your brain around, but bottom line is fresh produce that has been contaminated cannot be harvested. As we discussed in Module 1, pathogens on produce are difficult to remove by any amount of washing, either on the farm or in the consumer's kitchen We can't count on washing off contamination. That's why the produce safety rule is focused on prevention, okay? So again, the rule requires that growers identify and not harvest covered produce that is reasonably likely to be contaminated. So that's what we're going to focus on here in our pre-harvest risk assessment, identifying if produce has been contaminated and what steps are we going to take to make sure it doesn't get harvested. All right, so we have another clicker question. Again, just to drive home this point, this should be a really easy answer because the other ones don't even sound like they belong in Module 4. But you could turn this into a clicker question, like I did on the previous clicker question where I made boxes, so folks could use annotate. We could also ask this as a yes/no question, kind of like a true/false question, and have folks use the nonverbal feedback in Zoom. So there's different ways that you could use this, but I just wanted to share that this is another clicker question. You may or may not want to use it. It seems kind of silly because, I mean, the correct answer is pretty obvious to me, but it is good to pause and make sure folks know what that requirement is for the pre-harvest assessment. All right, slide 21. Any actions that growers take should be documented. This not only documents steps taken to reduce risks, but helps track trends in animal activity. And it ensures that workers have taken all the necessary actions to make sure the produce is safe. So these are shoulds. We should document these, and we'll get back to that in a minute when we talk about record keeping. But slides 21 and 22 give us some examples of corrective actions. Now, they're not all inclusive because growers are going to determine what corrective actions are needed for their unique situation. So number 3 kind of takes that all into account. But again, bottom line, do not harvest any produce that may be contaminated. Number 2, we talk about often in grower trainings, is the idea of a no harvest buffer zone. Now, the produce safety rule doesn't say what that radius should be. 0 to 25 feet is a big difference, as suggested here on this slide. But this is an opportunity to talk with growers about what a no harvest buffer zone is, maybe how they would determine that radius from the contamination event. So again, it's another good place to kind of give a little bit of extra time to make sure they understand that important detail. Also, the information on these 2 slides is closely linked to the training that must be provided to our harvest workers and the responsibility of one supervisor or other responsible party to ensure that produce safety rule requirements are carried out on the farm. So again, it's a good place to review those important details we talked about in Module 2. Be prepared to then link that information we just talked about on slides 21 and 22 with the training requirements described on slide 23. Spend some time covering the details on this slide. So workers must, again, you can emphasize the words must and should to really draw attention to them. You could change the color, for example. Workers must receive training to recognize and not harvest contaminated produce. Workers must inspect and correct problems with harvest containers and equipment, or report those issues to a supervisor. Workers must take measures to not harvest contaminated produce, and workers must wash their hands after handling animal feces or anytime their hands may be contaminated. So again, similar to Module 2, we focus first on what's the training those workers must receive. So as a grower, what do I have to provide in that training? And then we focus on what the workers must do. So they're broken down into 2 separate categories. And then finally, workers should report food safety concerns to a supervisor. If you have encouraged and fostered a food safety culture on the farm, then workers should feel safe coming forward with those concerns. So again, kind of reiterate what we talked about on the previous 2 slides, but also remind them of what we talked about in Module 2. Another thing that I really like about this slide is the title itself. So our workers are our front lines of defense. So again, it's just an important reminder that this training is so important because that role is so important. Those are the folks that are harvesting our food. They're going to see each individual piece of produce. So they're that line of defense to make sure it doesn't get harvested if it's contaminated. All right, slide 24 covers the final topic of each module, record keeping. Remind growers of all the records that should be kept. Those pre-plant land assessments, monitoring for animal activity, actions taken to reduce the risks related to animal intrusion, the pre-harvest risk assessments, intrusion and contamination events, and all corrective actions taken. So these are all shoulds. These are all things that are going to help me as a grower better manage this risk in the future. It's going to help me make sure that those practices I taught my workers are actually being implemented correctly. So these are really important records, but they are not required by the produce safety rule. The only required record for Module 4 is that worker training record. They must keep documentation that includes the dates of the training, topics covered that are related to wildlife, domesticated animals, and land use, and the workers who were trained on those topics. So again, not everyone on the farm is harvesting. They may not all need to have the training for the pre-harvest risk assessment, but those that are involved in those important roles have to receive this training. And those are the records that are required in Module 4. All right, slide 25. This one's another optional slide, but it does show an example of a wildlife and domesticated animal monitoring log. So if growers wanted to know what that looks like, you could share the slide or you could just skip over it because it's optional. And finally, the summary slide. Use it to reiterate the important points that you covered in this module for your unique audience. Again, you don't have to read these bullets word by word. Take the time to go over what was important, what did you spend more time on, what generated discussion. Again, just reiterating those really important points for your audience. What topics were most important to them? What were the big takeaways? And then ask if they have any remaining questions on this topic. For that part of the discussion, I recommend stopping screen share and just showing the gallery of videos. Have everybody turn their video on. So you can visually check for understanding. You can see if folks are nodding along. You can see if they look confused. You can ask specific folks, you can call someone out by name. Hey, I remember at the beginning of this module, you mentioned this. Were we able to answer your questions, or, did what I had to say generate additional questions? You can really engage folks in a conversation if you can see their faces. So I do recommend doing that for the discussion part at the end. All right, and that was my final slide. Just a reminder that the recordings from these office hours are posted on our trainer resources and trainer updates web pages. And if you're watching the recorded session and have any questions, please visit our website, go to the Contact Us page, and find your regional extension associate or one of our Spanish language extension associates. You'll get our email addresses and phone numbers there. If you have any additional questions about teaching Module 4, please reach out.